It's the dead of night in Rome, 3 a.m. on July the 10th, 1973. The air in the Eternal City is a thick, warm blanket, a uniquely Roman cocktail of ancient stone, blooming jasmine, diesel fumes, and the lingering scent of roasted chestnuts from a street vendor's long-extinguished fire. The grand Piazza Farnese, a masterpiece of Renaissance architecture, is a silent, moonlit stage. A 16-year-old boy, long-haired and lanky, every inch the 1970s rebel aristocrat, is ambushed. He's not just any teenager out for a late-night stroll. He's an heir, a symbol, a name that carries the weight of unimaginable riches. He is John Paul Getty III, and in a terrifying blur of motion, he is bundled into a Fiat van, a rough, musty-smelling cloth bag pulled over his head. The world dissolves into a cacophony of muffled shouts, the squeal of tires, and the smell of stale cigarettes. He has just been violently ripped from his life and turned into a commodity, a bargaining chip in a terrifying game he doesn't yet understand. But to call this a simple kidnapping is like calling the Roman Colosseum a local community theater. This was something more profound, more elemental. It was the brutal, inevitable collision of two powerful opposing forces, two worlds that should never have met. On one side, the 'Ndrangheta, a ruthless and brutally efficient Calabrian mafia syndicate, a shadowy organization that had perfected the dark art of kidnapping for ransom, turning human lives into a profitable, if gruesome, business model. On the other side, the Gettys, a family whose very name had become a global synonym for a fortune so immense, so staggering, that it had become almost mythological. A name that dripped with the promise of oil, power, and an endless, almost obscene river of wealth. Let's try for a moment to wrap our heads around that fortune. Just 16 years earlier, in 1957, Jean Paul Getty, the boy's grandfather, was officially declared the richest man in America by Fortune magazine. His net worth was estimated at over $1.6 billion. Let that number sink in for a moment. In today's money, that's a figure north of $15 billion. To put that into an even more staggering perspective, the entire annual budget for the city of New York in 1957 was just over $1.9 billion. J. Paul Getty, the man, could have personally funded the entire metropolis, its police, its fire department, its schools, its sanitation, everything, for the better part of a year, and still had hundreds of millions of dollars left over to play with. He was wealthier than many nations. He wasn't just rich, he was an institution, a one-man multinational corporation. He controlled 80% of a global oil empire, a complex pyramid of companies with the mighty Getty Oil at its apex. He owned the iconic Pierre Hotel on Fifth Avenue in New York, a landmark of luxury and elegance. He owned a magnificent 16th-century English manor with 72 rooms called Sutton Place, a palace he bought on a whim from the East, Duke of Sutherland. And most importantly to him, he owned one of the most significant private art collections in human history, a treasure trove of Greek and Roman antiquities, Renaissance paintings, and French decorative arts that would make kings and queens weep with envy. We're talking about a level of wealth that is, for most of us, completely abstract. A number with too many zeros to feel real, a fortune built on a river of black gold that flowed from the sun-scorched deserts of the Middle East. But here's the dark, twisted, beating heart of our story. The Getty family history is not a fairy tale of benevolent kings and happy endings. It is a brutal, sprawling, almost Shakespearean tragedy. It's a multi-generational saga of unimaginable wealth, punctuated by the most profound and relentless human suffering. It's a story of bitter family feuds, of debilitating depression, of shocking suicides, of fatal drug overdoses, and of a kidnapping that would horrify the world and lay bare the rot at the core of this golden dynasty. It is the ultimate cautionary tale. And that brings us to the central haunting mystery of it all. Why? Why would the richest man in the world, a man who could literally buy anything he desired, a man who would spend millions on a single painting without blinking an eye, refuse to pay the ransom for his own grandson? How could a family with all the money in the world be so relentlessly plagued by tragedy, so cursed by the very thing that was supposed to be its greatest blessing? And perhaps most intriguingly, what does the epic story of the Getty family, from its wildcatting origins to its tragic headline-grabbing implosion, truly tell us about the corrosive nature of wealth and the real price of a human life? To answer those questions, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to understand the architect of it all, the patriarch, the miser, the legend, Paul Getty. To understand the Getty fortune and the curse that seemed to come with it, you first have to understand the man who built it. And Paul Getty was a man of staggering, almost dizzying contradictions. He was a certified genius in the world of business, a man who could look at a geological map and see a billion-dollar oil field where others saw only barren desert. He was a ruthless negotiator, a corporate predator who built a global empire by outmaneuvering giants and rewriting the rules of the game. But he was also a man who, despite his immense wealth, was famously, almost pathologically, cheap. This was the man who, in his 72-room mansion, installed a payphone to prevent his guests and his own sons from running up his phone bill. This was the man who would wash his own socks in his hotel sink to avoid paying for laundry service. While his contemporaries, men like Rockefeller and Carnegie, were building dynasties and cementing their legacies with grand philanthropic gestures, Getty was doing something different. He was accumulating, relentlessly. Not just money, but art, houses, and, most notoriously, women. He was married 5 times, had 5 sons, and by his own boastful admission, had over 100 lovers. He treated his personal relationships like business deals, pitting his mistresses against each other, showering them with gifts one moment and demanding repayment the next. He used money not as a tool of generosity, but as his primary instrument of control and, in his own twisted way, affection. He was a collector, and people, just like his paintings and statues, were objects to be acquired, managed, and controlled. But where did this obsessive, all-consuming drive come from? It didn't start with him. It started with his father, George Franklin Getty. George was a man who embodied the American dream. A successful lawyer in Minneapolis, he was a man of comfortable but not extraordinary means. He was a devout Christian Scientist, a man of principle and discipline. Then, in 1903, at the age of 48, he took a monumental gamble. He packed up his life, moved his family to the rough-and-tumble frontier of Oklahoma, and became a wildcatter, an independent oil prospector. He founded the Minahoma Oil Company, and against all odds, he struck it rich. George was a success story, a man who made his own fortune through hard work and faith. But his son, Paul, was a different breed entirely. He was destined to eclipse his father in every conceivable way and to abandon every principle his father held dear. Born in 1892, young Paul was a product of this new oil wealth, but he was also forged by his father's stern, demanding nature. He grew up not in the rugged oil fields, but in the burgeoning metropolis of Los Angeles. He was a restless, ambitious, and fiercely intelligent young man. After graduating from Oxford with a degree in economics and political science, he was given a choice by his father: join the family business or go it alone. At 21, with a $10,000 loan from his father, he arrived in Tulsa, Oklahoma, ready to make his own mark. He wasn't content to work in his father's shadow. He started buying and selling oil leases, operating on a 70-30 split with his father. He had an almost supernatural instinct for the business, a sixth sense for where the oil was hiding, a gambler's nerve, and a scholar's analytical mind. In less than 2 years, he had made his first $1 million. He was just 23 years old. And what does a 23-year-old millionaire do in the 1910s? He retires. For the next 2 years, Getty moved back to Los Angeles and lived what the New York Times would later describe as a gaudy, girl-filled life. He was a notorious playboy, a man about town, burning through his money and his reputation with equal abandon. His father was appalled, disgusted by his son's hedonism and lack of moral fiber. But the allure of the oil fields, the thrill of the deal, was too strong to resist. He went back to work, and this time, he wouldn't stop until he was the richest man in the world. By the time his father George died in 1930, Paul Getty was already a formidable figure in the oil industry. He had also been married 3 times, divorced twice, and had 2 sons. His father, deeply disapproving of his son's profligate lifestyle and multiple divorces, left him only a fraction of the family fortune, a mere $500,000 out of a $10 million estate. It was a pointed, public rebuke, a final attempt by the old man to impose his will. But it didn't matter. J. Paul was about to use the greatest economic crisis in American history, the Great Depression, as his personal springboard to unimaginable wealth. While the world crumbled, Getty sharpened his knives and prepared for a feast. While other titans of industry were ruined by the Great Depression, J. Paul Getty thrived. He saw the panic not as a crisis, but as the greatest buying opportunity in a generation. While businesses were collapsing and stocks were becoming worthless, Getty, with his cool nerve and ready cash, went on a shopping spree. He started buying up oil companies, often for pennies on the dollar. He was a predator in a world of prey, a shark circling weakened swimmers. He had a singular, all-consuming vision to create a fully integrated oil giant, a behemoth that would control every single step of the process, from the moment a drill bit pierced the earth to the moment gasoline was pumped into a car's tank. He wanted to own the exploration, the production, the refining, the shipping, and the distribution. This was his dream, his grand mission, and he pursued it with a relentless, almost inhuman focus. His strategy was simple but brutal. He would identify a target company, often one much larger and more established than his own, and begin quietly, patiently acquiring its stock. He was a master of the hostile takeover, a corporate raider decades before the term even existed. He would wait for a moment of weakness, a dip in the stock price, a moment of corporate uncertainty, and then he would pounce. He didn't just want to build a company, he wanted to conquer an industry. And his greatest prize, the crown jewel he coveted above all others, was a company called Tidewater Associated Oil Company. It was a giant, one of the top 10 oil companies in the country, with a vast network of refineries and gas stations. And Getty decided he would have it. The battle for Tidewater was an epic, multi-decade corporate war. It was a chess match played out on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, a brutal back-alley fight conducted in boardrooms and lawyers' offices. Getty spent nearly 20 years and millions of dollars in his relentless quest to gain control. He faced off against a powerful consortium of the nation's biggest oil companies, the predecessors of giants like Chevron and Mobil, all determined to keep this upstart outsider from breaking into their exclusive club. They saw him as a dangerous maverick, a threat to their stable, ordered world. But Getty was more patient, more cunning, and ultimately more ruthless than any of them. By the early 1950s, after a labyrinthine series of legal battles and proxy fights, he had won. He had his prize. He had built his empire. In 1956, he finally restructured his vast and complex holdings, placing the mighty Getty Oil Company at the very top of a global pyramid, of which he personally owned an astonishing 80%. He had built a monolith, a testament to his own ambition and genius. But even that wasn't enough. The world of international oil was dominated by a powerful cartel known as the Seven Sisters, a group of Anglo-American giants like BP, Shell, and Standard Oil who controlled the vast majority of the world's oil reserves outside of the United States. They were a club, and Getty was not a member. To join that exclusive club, to truly become a king of the world, he would have to do something audacious, something that would change the face of the oil industry forever. He set his sights on the one place where the game was still open, the one place where a bold enough player could still carve out a kingdom: the Middle East. Specifically, a desolate, sun-scorched 2,200 square mile patch of desert known as the Neutral Zone, a barren no-man's land jointly controlled by Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. The big players had already cherry-picked the most promising territories in the region. The Neutral Zone was considered a long shot, a fool's errand, a risky bet not worth taking. The geology was unproven, the logistics were a nightmare. But J. Paul Getty saw potential. He saw what no one else did, and he was willing to bet the farm on it. In 1948, Getty entered into negotiations with King Abdulaziz Al Saud of Saudi Arabia for the oil rights to the Neutral Zone. The terms he offered were so extravagant, so far beyond the industry standard, that his competitors thought he had lost his mind. He agreed to pay the king $9.5 million upfront in cash. That's over $100 million in today's money, just for the right to start looking for oil. He also guaranteed a $1 million annual royalty for 60 years, regardless of whether he found a single drop of oil or not. And most shockingly, he agreed to pay a royalty of 55 cents per barrel, more than double the 21 cents per barrel that the major American companies were paying in Saudi Arabia. At a time when oil was trading at just $2 a barrel, this was an insane, almost suicidal gamble. His advisors told him he was crazy. His competitors laughed at him, convinced he was about to bankrupt himself. He was betting a significant portion of his hard-won fortune on a patch of sand that most experts believed was barren. But Getty had done his homework. He had studied the geological surveys. He had a hunch, a deep instinctual feeling, and he trusted his instincts more than he trusted any expert. In a characteristically detached move, he sent his son, George Getty II, to the Middle East to oversee the grueling, difficult operation. He himself never set foot in the region. He would manage his billion-dollar gamble by telegram from his suite at the Ritz in Paris. For 4 long, agonizing years, they drilled, and for 4 long years, they found nothing but sand and disappointment. The costs mounted, soaring past $30 million. The pressure was immense. Getty poured millions of dollars into the project, his reputation, and a huge chunk of his fortune on the line. The laughter of his competitors grew louder. It seemed his legendary luck, his Midas touch, had finally run out. But Getty didn't flinch. He kept drilling. He was a man possessed by his own conviction, and then, in 1953, it happened. They struck oil, not just a little oil, a gusher, a massive world-class oil field that would ultimately produce over 16 million barrels a year. Getty's insane gamble had paid off in the most spectacular way imaginable. His fortune didn't just grow, it exploded. Shares in his company soared. He had not only joined the club of oil giants, he had kicked the door down, built his own clubhouse, and declared himself the new king. He had challenged the Seven Sisters and won, forever changing the power dynamics of the global oil industry. Over the next few years, he invested $600 million to build his integrated global oil giant. He built refineries, pipelines, and a fleet of supertankers, the famous Getty tankers, to carry his oil to every corner of the globe. He had achieved his vision. He was no longer just a rich man. He was an industrial titan, a force of nature. And in 1957, Fortune magazine made it official, proclaiming him the richest man in America. The world now knew the name J. Paul Getty. But this is where the story takes its dark and tragic turn, because the same qualities that made him a brilliant businessman, his ruthlessness, his emotional detachment, his single-minded focus on accumulation, would make him a disastrous family man. The story of the Getty family is not just a story of how to make a fortune, it's a chilling cautionary tale about what that fortune can cost. So, what was it truly like to be a Getty? From the outside, it was a life of unimaginable privilege, a fairy tale existence in a world of sprawling estates, private jets, and endless possibilities. It was a life without material want, a life where any desire could be instantly gratified. But the reality, the lived experience of being a Getty, was far darker. A gilded cage where the bars were made of gold but were bars nonetheless. The Getty family was a constellation of broken people orbiting a cold, distant, and demanding sun. And that sun was J. Paul Getty. Imagine you're one of his 5 sons. You have a father who is the richest man in the world, a man who can buy countries, but who communicates with you primarily through sarcastic, hypercritical memos and telegrams. A man who, as we've mentioned, installed a payphone in his 72-room mansion because he didn't want his guests, including his own family, to feel they were imposing by making a simple phone call. This wasn't just a quirk, it was a philosophy. It was a way of wielding power, of reminding everyone around him at all times who was in control, who held the purse strings, who was the source of all their comfort and all their misery. He created a system of dependence and then punished them for it. This relentless emotional and financial stinginess had a devastating, corrosive effect on his children. The first to truly buckle under its immense weight was his oldest son, George Franklin Getty II. George was, by all accounts, a capable and intelligent man. He wasn't a playboy or a rebel. He had done everything his father asked of him. He had worked on the pivotal neutral zone deal, a turning point in the family's fortunes. He had risen to become an executive vice president at Getty Oil and was a respected director at both Bank of America and Douglas Aircraft. He was, by any objective measure, a success, the dutiful son. But it was never enough for his father. From his magnificent English estate at Sutton Place, J. Paul would dispatch a constant stream of critical, demeaning messages to George in Los Angeles. Memos designed to undermine his confidence, to question his decisions, to remind him that he was always being watched and always found wanting. George was a senior executive at a massive corporation, yet his father treated him like an incompetent office boy. He descended into a deep, debilitating depression, a profound and unshakable misery born from the fact that he could never, ever earn his father's praise or admiration. In June of 1973, just a month before his nephew's kidnapping, the pressure became too much to bear. After a day at the office, George went home to his lavish Bel Air mansion, and in a haze of alcohol and despair, he took a lethal dose of barbiturates, stabbed himself crudely with a barbecue fork, and locked himself in his bedroom. He died the next day. He was just 48 years old. The patriarch's reaction was chillingly detached. He questioned the coroner's report of suicide, suggesting it must have been an accident. The machine of the Getty empire barely paused. But the tragedy was a contagion, a virus that was spreading rapidly through the family tree. And the next to be infected was J. Paul's other son, Eugene Paul Getty, who would later change his name to the more prestigious J. Paul Getty Jr. As a young man, he was his father's favorite, a charming and handsome heir who was groomed to take a leading role in the family empire. He was dispatched to Italy to run Getty Oil's European operations. He married his college sweetheart, the athletic and capable Gail Harris, and together they had 4 children. He was on the golden path to success, the designated crown prince. But the immense pressure of being a Getty, of living under the long, cold shadow of his formidable father, took its inevitable toll. The life in Rome, far from the direct gaze of his father, offered a dangerous freedom. In 1964, he divorced Gail and fell headfirst into a completely different world. He met and married Talitha Pohl, a woman who was his polar opposite. She was a beautiful, charismatic, and dangerously alluring actress and designer, the daughter of a Dutch artist who had grown up in the exotic Dutch East Indies. Together, they became the undisputed darlings of Rome's bohemian underworld, a decadent world of artists, musicians, and dissolute aristocrats. They were the ultimate jet-set couple, holding court in Rome and a lavish palace in Marrakesh, hanging out with the likes of Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and the rest of the Rolling Stones. They were beautiful, glamorous, and spiraling into a world of heavy hedonistic drug use. Their life was a psychedelic whirlwind of parties, travel, and unrestrained excess. They even named their son Tara Gabriel Galaxy Gramophone, a name that perfectly encapsulated the trippy, anything-goes spirit of the times. But the dream was rapidly turning into a nightmare. Talitha, struggling with her own severe heroin addiction, left him. A devastated J. Paul Jr. convinced her to return to Rome for a reconciliation. It was a fatal mistake. On July 11, 1971, Talitha was found dead in their apartment from a heroin overdose. She was just 30 years old. J. Paul Jr. was shattered, a broken man who would spend years drifting in a fog of grief and addiction, a ghost haunting the edges of his own life. And what of the children caught in the crossfire of this chaos? J. Paul Jr. and Gail's son, John Paul Getty III, was growing up in Rome. But he wasn't living the life of a privileged, protected heir. He was a wild child, a full-blown rebel, kicked out of a string of elite boarding schools, once for painting the hallways in a bizarre tribute to the Manson family. He was living a bohemian life of his own by the age of 15. He was a fixture in Rome's nightclubs, a passionate participant in left-wing demonstrations. He supported himself by making and selling his own jewelry and art, and even by posing nude for magazines. He was known to the Italian press as the Golden Hippie, a symbol of youthful rebellion and decadent wealth. He was a young man adrift, a product of his family's benign neglect and his own fiercely rebellious spirit. He had a famous name in a distant trust fund, but he was emotionally and practically abandoned. His father was lost in his own world of grief, and his mother, Gail, was left to raise 4 children with limited financial support from the Getty empire. Paul was a boy crying out for attention, for boundaries, for some semblance of a normal life. And in the hot, sticky summer of 1973, that famous name would make him a target. It would plunge him and the entire Getty family into a crisis that would capture the world's attention, a horrifying drama that would expose the dark, rotten heart of the Getty dynasty for all to see. Picture it again. Rome, 3 a.m., July 10th, 1973. John Paul Getty III, the golden hippie, is violently snatched from his bohemian life. For his mother, Gail Harris, living a modest life in Rome, the nightmare begins with a phone call 2 days later. The voice on the other end is rough, demanding. The price for her son's life is $17 million, an astronomical, impossible sum. When she protests that she doesn't have that kind of money, that she is divorced from the Getty fortune, the kidnapper's response is chillingly simple and direct. Get it from London. But in London, in the baronial splendor of Sutton Place, the richest man in the world is unmoved. Initially, the kidnapping is met with a shocking degree of skepticism. The Italian police, accustomed to the antics of the wealthy and rebellious youth, are dismissive. Even some members of the Getty family, including J. Paul himself, suspect it's a hoax. Young Paul, in his frequent fits of youthful rebellion and frustration, had often joked about faking his own kidnapping to squeeze some money out of his notoriously tight-fisted grandfather. It was a tragic, almost unbelievable coincidence that his dark joke had become a horrifying reality. But as the days bleed into weeks and a desperate scrawled letter from Paul arrives, "Dear Mummy, since Monday I have fallen into the hands of kidnappers. Don't let me be killed." The grim reality of the situation begins to sink in. J. Paul Getty Jr., now living a reclusive life in London, is frantic. He is a man broken by grief and addiction, and he doesn't have anything close to $17 million. He turns to the only person who does, his father, the patriarch, the billionaire, the man who held the power of life and death in his checkbook. And J. Paul Getty's response would become the stuff of legend, a quote that would echo through the decades as a perfect, horrifying distillation of his cold, calculating worldview. He went on the record, speaking to the press, and declared, "I have 14 other grandchildren. If I pay 1 penny now, then I will have 14 kidnapped grandchildren." He refused to pay. Not a dollar, not a lira, not a penny. He saw it not as a family crisis, but as a business negotiation. And in his mind, paying the ransom was a bad deal. It would set a dangerous precedent, expose his other grandchildren to risk. It was a decision that made a certain kind of cold, logical sense to a billionaire, and no sense at all to a grandfather. While his grandfather pontificated to the media and treated his life as a line item on a balance sheet, John Paul Getty III was living in a waking hell. He was moved from one squalid hiding place to another, from a dingy apartment to a dark, damp cave in the rugged mountains of Calabria, the heartland of the 'Ndrangheta. He was chained to a stake, beaten, tortured, his spirit slowly being crushed under the weight of his captor's brutality and his family's shocking indifference. He spent his 17th birthday in captivity, a prisoner of his family's name, a pawn in a game he couldn't comprehend. The kidnappers, a motley crew of small-time criminals and hardened mafiosi, were growing impatient. The negotiations were going nowhere. The old man in London wasn't budging. They were losing money, and their valuable asset was becoming a liability. So, they decided to escalate, to prove they were serious, to force the old man's hand. In November, 4 long, agonizing months after the kidnapping, a package arrived at the offices of a Roman newspaper, Il Messaggero. Inside was a lock of reddish hair and a severed human ear. A note accompanied the gruesome delivery, its message stark and terrifying. "This is Paul's ear. If we don't get some money within 10 days, the other ear will arrive. In other words, he will arrive in little pieces." The world was horrified. The image of the mutilated teenager, once a symbol of carefree youthful rebellion, was now a symbol of unimaginable suffering and cruelty. The international media went into a frenzy. The pressure on J. Paul Getty became immense, a global wave of condemnation. The media, the public, his own shattered family. Everyone was begging him, pleading with him to pay the ransom and save his grandson's life. Finally, after this brutal act of mutilation, he relented. But even in this moment of profound crisis, he was a businessman. He was, to the very end, J. Paul Getty. He didn't pay the full $17 million he negotiated. Through his security consultants, he got the price down to just under $3 million, and even then, he didn't simply pay it. In a final, breathtaking act of miserliness, he agreed to pay $2.2 million himself, the maximum amount that his army of accountants advised would be tax-deductible. The remaining amount, nearly $1 million, he loaned to his son, J. Paul Jr., the father of the kidnapped boy. At 4% interest. Let that sink in for a moment. He charged his own son, a man he had emotionally and financially crippled, interest on the money to save his grandson's life. It was a move of such cold, calculated cruelty that it almost defies belief. On December 15, 1973, after 5 long, brutal months in captivity, John Paul Getty III was released. He was found on a snow-covered highway in southern Italy, shivering, malnourished, and alone. The ransom had been paid. The boy was alive, but he was not the same. The golden hippie was gone, replaced by a haunted, traumatized young man with a scarred ear and a spirit that had been irrevocably broken. The kidnapping was over, but the tragedy of John Paul Getty III was just beginning. The world, for a brief, flickering moment, celebrated the return of John Paul Getty III. The headlines screamed of his release, of the end of the terrifying 5-month ordeal. But for Paul, the ordeal was far from over. He had survived the kidnapping, but he now faced a new, more insidious kind of captivity, the inescapable prison of his own trauma. The physical scars were the least of it. His ear was painstakingly reconstructed through a series of complex surgeries, but the psychological wounds, the deep festering wounds to his soul, were beyond the reach of any surgeon's knife. The world saw a survivor. He felt like a ghost. He tried, with a desperate, almost frantic energy, to reclaim his life, to outrun the ghosts of Calabria. He married a German photographer and filmmaker, Gisela Martine Zacher, just 2 years after his release, in a ceremony that defied his family's wishes. He became a father to a son, Balthazar. He threw himself into the avant-garde art and film scene of the late 1970s, becoming a peripheral but notable figure in Andy Warhol's factory circle in New York. He was trying to build a new identity, to be an artist, a husband, a father, anything other than just the boy who was kidnapped. But the past was a shadow he could not shake. He was haunted by the memory of the cave, of the beatings, of the sheer, soul-crushing terror, and the profound betrayal. He fell deeper and deeper into a world of hard drugs and alcohol, a desperate, self-destructive attempt to numb the relentless pain and silence the screaming in his head. In 1981, at the age of just 25, his ravaged body finally gave out. After a night of heavy drinking, he ingested a potent, nearly lethal cocktail of Valium, methadone, and alcohol. It caused acute liver failure and triggered a massive, debilitating stroke. It didn't kill him, but it condemned him to a living death. The stroke left him a quadriplegic, nearly blind, and unable to speak. For the next 30 years, he was confined to a wheelchair, a prisoner in his own body, his brilliant, rebellious mind trapped in a cage of silence and paralysis. The vibrant, defiant golden hippie was gone forever. A final, tragic casualty of the Getty curse. His mother, Gail Harris, the one person who had fought for him, the one constant in his chaotic life, cared for him with unwavering devotion until his death in February 2011 at the age of 54. His life was a long, slow-motion tragedy that began the day he was born a Getty. And what of the patriarch, the architect of all this misery and wealth? J. Paul Getty died on June 6, 1976, just 3 years after the kidnapping. He never saw his grandson Paul again. He died as he had lived for the last 2 decades of his life, Alone, surrounded by his priceless art collection, in his grand English manner, a king in a self-imposed exile. He left the bulk of his vast fortune, over 661 million, the equivalent of nearly 3 billion today, not to his shattered family, but to his museum, the J. Paul Getty Museum in California. It was his final and perhaps most telling act of emotional detachment. He chose to immortalize himself through his art, not his bloodline. His legacy would be one of marble and canvas, not of family and love. He had built an empire of things, and in the end, that was all he had. His death, however, did not end the family drama. It simply opened a new, even more contentious chapter, the battle for the billions. The family's real wealth, the source of its immense power, was tied up in the Sarah C. Getty Trust, a fund established by J. Paul's devoutly religious mother back in the 1930s to provide for future generations. By the 1980s, this trust held a massive 40% stake in Getty Oil. And the sole trustee, the man with his finger on the button of this financial nuclear weapon, was J. Paul's fourth son, Gordon Getty, a quiet, opera-loving intellectual who had long been dismissed by his father as lacking the killer instinct for business. But Gordon, the quiet one, the composer, would prove to be the most ruthless of them all. Frustrated with the management of Getty Oil, he staged a boardroom coup. In 1984, in a move that shocked the business world and sent tremors through Wall Street, he orchestrated the sale of Getty Oil, the company his father had spent a lifetime building, to its rival, Texaco, for a staggering $10.1 billion. It was one of the largest corporate takeovers in history. The sale triggered a legendary legal firestorm, not for the Gettys, but for the buyer. Texaco ended up in a separate, epic legal battle with Pennzoil, which had made a prior, informal agreement to buy Getty Oil, a battle that would ultimately bankrupt Texaco. But for the Gettys, the sale of the company was the starting gun for an all-out war over the spoils. The following year, Gordon moved to dissolve the family trust, unlocking a $4 billion fortune. What followed was a feeding frenzy, a series of bitter and protracted legal battles as the various warring factions of the Getty clan sued, countersued, and battled for their piece of the pie. It was a spectacle of greed and entitlement, played out in the public eye. The final settlement, reached in 1985, was a bonanza. Gordon, his brother J. Paul Jr., by then a British citizen and philanthropist, and the three daughters of the deceased George Getty II each received a staggering $750 million. The descendants of J. Paul's other estranged son, Jean-Roland Getty, who had been left with a pittance in his father's will, split the remaining $750 million with other beneficiaries. The money, the source of all their pain, was finally in their hands. And the curse, the relentless Getty curse, continued to work its dark magic. Gordon Getty, the man who had unlocked the family fortune, was himself at the center of a major scandal in 1999, when it was revealed that he had been living a secret double life for 14 years, with a second family in Los Angeles that included 3 daughters. The man who was seen as the family's straight arrow, the respectable philanthropist, was just as tangled in the web of secrets and lies as his father had been. The apple, it seemed, had not fallen far from the tree. So we return, finally, to our central questions. Why did J. Paul Getty refuse to pay the ransom? The answer, it seems, lies in the very core of his character. He was a man who saw the world not in terms of human emotion, but in terms of numbers, of assets and liabilities, of profit and loss. The kidnapping of his grandson was not a family crisis. It was a business transaction. And in his cold, hard, and unforgiving calculus, paying the ransom was a bad deal. It was a decision that made perfect, logical sense to a billionaire obsessed with preserving his capital, and no sense at all to a grandfather. And why was this family, with all the money in the world, so relentlessly plagued by tragedy? Perhaps the most profound and disturbing answer is that the fortune itself was the tragedy. It was a corrosive, toxic force, a poison that seeped into every relationship, every interaction. It created a world of profound emotional distance, of neglect, of children who were raised with everything they could ever want, and nothing they truly needed. The Getty story is a brutal cautionary tale that serves as a powerful reminder that money cannot buy happiness, that it cannot shield you from pain, and that in the end, the things that truly matter, love, connection, empathy, are the things that can never be bought or sold. But the story doesn't end in pure tragedy. In the generations that followed, there have been glimmers of hope, of resilience, of a conscious and determined effort to break the curse. Mark Getty, one of J. Paul Jr.'s sons, co-founded Getty Images in 1995, building a new kind of Getty empire, one based not on oil, but on creativity, imagery, and vision. It became the world's leading supplier of stock photography and digital media. Other members of the family, like Aline Getty, who bravely went public with her HIV diagnosis in the 1990s, and Ariadne Getty, have become major philanthropists, dedicating their lives and their fortunes to causes like AIDS research, climate change, and LGBTQ+ rights. They are trying, in their own ways, to redeem the Getty name, to turn a legacy of pain into a force for good. The story of the Getty family is a modern-day Greek tragedy, a sprawling, epic cautionary tale for our age of extreme wealth and celebrity. It's a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable and profound questions about the nature of money, the meaning of family, and the ultimate price of a human life. It's a story that proves, in the most dramatic and heartbreaking way imaginable, that you can have all the money in the world and still be the poorest man of all.